Mostly want to just start out with a big thank you to you all. I know how much work it is to bring an exhibit to campus, to get funding together, to mobilize people, and particularly to mobilize an academic community at this time of year. We always think we have so much time in an academic year, and then you come back after break, and it's all very, very condensed. So thank you all for taking time out of a busy schedule, and also special thanks to Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies, to the Department of Romance Languages, and Rocio in particular, to my former student, Tony, and to all the people who have made this possible, the Dean's Office, and to the many students who have already showed interest in this. I asked Rocio, would you like me to read a paper, something more formal, or would you like this to be what they say in Spanish, a charla? And so this is going to be a charla that will be very informal, and at any point, because it's a charla, feel free to ask a question. If something's not clear, raise your hand. I'll count on you to be my timekeeper since I don't have something that's timed, so that we have time for other people's comments and questions. But I think what Rocio suggested is what might be most interesting to people is, how does somebody go about starting a project like this? So I started out as a history major, and I've been talking to some of the undergraduates here to see their interests. And history major as an undergraduate, and mostly I liked history because it was a way to understand the past, and it just fascinated me. And then I went to Spain for my junior year and got interested in things Spanish, and went on to grad school, mostly because I interviewed for other jobs, and I don't want to be a banker, I don't want to be a social worker. I seem to like to study. I might as well go to graduate school. So, I always had this idea that people who wrote books always knew what they wanted to do, and always had these ideas, and that wasn't me. It was just kind of following one foot after another, kind of literally. And so I got to graduate school and was going to work on visual images of the Conquest, because the Conquest interested me a lot. And I got to a rare book library, and I found a nun's manuscript. She was writing her spiritual autobiography in the 17th century. It had never been published. People knew of the manuscript but thought it had been lost. And this 12-volume manuscript was in the John Carter Brown Library. And I kept thinking, well, okay, I'm going to do my dissertation on this topic, and then I'd sneak back to read the diary a little bit more. And pretty soon I just thought, I might as well have this be my dissertation topic, because if this seems like fun, then that's probably a good idea to do a dissertation on a fun topic. So I spent quite a few years working in archival documents. She was in colonial Mexico and talks a lot about family life in the 17th century from a normal woman's point of view. She was not a Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. She wrote in very colloquial language. And so that was my I'd say my first career in academia. And then because I was working, and she founded a convent in Puebla and in Oaxaca in Mexico. And so as I was doing archival research, and those are still functioning convents, and I would start interviewing nuns who still are part of those convents, everybody would talk to me about the Conquest. I'd take a taxi someplace, and the taxi driver would start talking about the Conquest of Mexico. I would go have lunch someplace, and somebody would start talking about the Conquest of Mexico. And so after years and years of this, once I finally got to the point where, you get promoted and you really have true academic freedom, and I thought, I'm going to just work on talking to Mexicans about the Conquest. That's going to be my book project. I had this intuition, and often what we do is just following an intuition, that this was a very important topic, but I didn't know why. I'm, gringuita, from the Midwest, had no Hispanic background, fascinated by the culture, but very much coming as an outsider to this material, but somebody who tries to appreciate it. And so I began with a small grant, and I thought, well, I'll just follow Cortez's route of conquest from Veracruz, and you can see this is a kind of composite map, and it goes through what's called Tlaxcala and Cholula and Puebla, central Mexico, and then on to what was Tenochtitlan, today Mexico City. And I'll just take buses and taxis, and I just had a little microphone. Actually, our youngest was just 6 months, so she was strapped on to me, and just started and went with a photographer just to see if I had a project, because you have to kind of first test pilot something. So, and I was amazed that people wanted to talk. Everybody wanted to talk. I fully expected some people to say, you're an American, this is our history, or no, please don't record me. please don't take my pictures. But instead, they invited me to their homes. They wanted me to meet their other people that they wanted to talk about. They wanted me to get in their cars to take me to another historical site that would tell me more of the story. And so I figured, well, I'm interested in this and I'm learning a lot, so this is a good project. That photographer, unfortunately, got Crohn's disease, so he couldn't continue on the project. So then I contracted another photographer for my second trip. We got fundings from the Lilly Foundation. He was a former National Geographic photographer, Steve Raymer. Those are the photographs that are now on exhibit here and part of the exhibit. So he traveled with me along this route during one of my trips. I had continued with 4 more trips for interviews. And my basic point of departure is that this, what they call the Ruta de Cortés, or the Ruta de la Conquista, is not only a historical geographical route, but it's also a symbolic route about culture and identification or identity, however you want to use that term. It's changing these days, and how people talk about their past. Because what I found as I started to talk to people and started looking at images is that history is both a national project for creating a Mexican identity, and it's also very much a personal project, that people recount the conquest story according to what their personal identification with it is. That personal identification is highly dependent on ethnicity, tradition, and what part of this conquest route they live in. For those of you who aren't real familiar with the conquest, Cortez starts in Veracruz, he moves up to Zempoala, the center of the Totonaco civilization. They basically ally with him, providing him with food and carriers. He continues on to the Tlaxcala lands. He has an encounter with the Tlaxcaltecas that were not friendly with what is known as the Aztec civilization. After a couple skirmishes, they become his allies. That's really why he was able to finally win Tenochtitlan, because he had thousands and thousands of allies. With the Tlaxcaltecas, they go to Cholula, which was the spiritual center of Mesoamerica. A terrible massacre takes place there of all the spiritual leaders, and then they move on to Mexico, Tenochtitlan. They're invited into the city, and then they're expelled, and then Cortez retakes the city by putting the city under siege for 30 days. There are lots more details within that picture, but that becomes important because this geographical historical route becomes the center points for how I interviewed people. So I interviewed people in Veracruz in 3 places, Tlaxcala, Cholula, and then also the Spanish city that was founded, Puebla, and the center, Tenochtitlan. So within this symbolic route, or this trope, I use I decided to use a 4-point methodology. 1, I go back to historical sources about the conquest, and even historical sources are in great conflict with each other. What Cortez and Bernal Diaz say is very different than what Alvar Ichichotl or Bernardino Sahagún say about the conquest, and it depends very much on the ethnicities, whether they allied with the Spaniards or did not ally with the Spaniards. So that's one source that I use. Another source is what I call just popular materials, cultural materials. I started looking at comics, murals, theater, movies, novels, ballads, because if you go to Mexico, images of the conquest are everywhere, whether it's in songs, images of Malinche, of Cortez, whether it's on the walls of the National Palace. And so these images, whether verbal or visual, constantly are reinterpreting and retelling the story of the conquest in different ways. And people are acculturated to that. In with those popular materials, I also began to study the statewide mandatory textbooks published by the Secretaría de Educación Pública, because they are school children's first formal contact or engagement with the conquest narrative. So that was my second source. The third source is what I called a living archive. So I interviewed over 100 people. In every interview, I posed the same 4 basic questions. What do you think of a Cortez? in the conquest? How did you learn about it? Do you think there's evidence of the conquest today? And the last and most interesting question tended to be, what else do I need to know for my book? And it was in that last question that I got my best material. What do you think I should know as an outsider? And that's where they'd say, oh, I want to take you to this place. You need to talk to this person. And that's also then when they left the official story that maybe they learned in school and gave me a story that was highly personalized often. So that was the third source. And then the fourth source were the visual images. So contemporary photographs that you'll see in the exhibit today, images from the codices that are also, some of that's in the exhibit today. And then I started to expand out. As I started talking to more and more Mexicans, the diversity of opinions, of traditions, of ethnicities, of class difference was really quite eye-opening to me. And here I've been studying this stuff for years. And so I decided to start asking informants if they might send me some of their own photographs. So I got photographs of people's abuelas. That in one case it was her abuela that fed Zapata's army. And she said, this is important because I think that the Mexico realmente nace with the revolution. It has nothing to do with the Spanish conquest. And I got pictures of people in their indigenous communities playing the traditional music. And so it adds a much more personal element to the imagery. I also started studying imagery of things like there was a national campaign, I think it was 3 years ago, for anybody know the marca de cerveza Indio? And the ad, the marketing was más indio que nunca. So, what is that about? So just these, because as I started talking to people from these four basic questions, two things came up in almost every interview. One was this idea that conquest is ongoing, that it's continuing in some form or another, whether it's through the Mexican state, whether it's through the elite, more Spanish population in Mexico. And the part that I didn't anticipate, but again, it was a blind spot completely, the role of the U.S. One of my conclusions is one of the reasons that the conquest narrative is so on the tip of everybody's tongue in Mexico is because they're still dealing with the consequences of conquest. 100 and some years ago, half of Mexico was conquered or taken or stolen, however you want to, whatever word you want to use, by the U.S. And now, 1 in 10 Mexicans live in the U.S. And so there's a sense of loss of economic sovereignty now because of capitalism, of cultural sovereignty because of the influence of U.S. Businesses and products. And so there's this ongoing sense of some sort of a different kind of conquest. There's also, on one level, there's also the sense of the conquest that Mexican, on the national level, the Mexican government, one guy called it a schizophrenic policy, while they're saying, okay, we now have 63 indigenous languages. We're a multi-ethnic country. It's no longer just mestizo. It's, let's recognize that we have, all these official ethnicities and languages. But on a practical level, many things are not being done to support indigenous communities. Somebody was telling me about her interest in Latin American ecosystems and, what happens when they come in and they want to create a hydroelectric plant. And those waters have been considered sacred to the indigenous community there. So there's a sense of ongoing economic conquest, either by the Mexican state or by the international global economy. And so that was one of the conclusions that I took away from the project, that it's very unlike the idea of conquest in the United States. It's still a part of the lived reality for many people. And so originally the book had 3 parts: interviews from Veracruz, interviews from the center, Tlaxcala, Cholula, Puebla, and then images from DF. I had to spend 2 more years doing, what do Mexicans and Mexican Americans living in the U.S. think? Because everybody would talk about el otro lado, in the sense of, I've got this brother, or my dad, or I was born there but I came back. And so what is that dynamic relationship between Mexico and the U.S. and how is that still seen in part as some sort of a conquest dynamic? And so I started interviewing people that live in Indiana who are Mexican and Mexican Americans. It's just kind of a sampling of what some of the ideas are. And then what is it that they're teaching their children about the conquest? So if they're raising children here who are first generation Americans, what are they teaching them? What happens to somebody who's, one of them was, he's an 18-year-old at IU, and he said, the conquest is ongoing. I was crossed over illegally as a 2-year-old. I had no say in the matter, and I've come of age, but I can't drive. I can't vote. I have to stay hidden to a certain degree. And so that became kind of an unexpected outcome of the research project. So let me see. So I guess maybe out of all of that, what starts out is looking at this symbolic Ruta de Cortes becomes a site of memory, and how physical places become ways, centers for people to reenact at times history. The Conchero Aztec dancers are making a big comeback. They number in the tens of thousands now. People are starting to write books about local history. The muralist movement has started up again, through reinterpreting that through history. Small towns that have never written about their history before are collecting oral histories. They've started an indigenous languages literary journal that now is online through Oxford University. So there's just an amazing number of cultural products and artifacts that are coming out of this reinterpretation of history, and so there's a sense that history, I guess, really matters, and that a focal point has been and continues to be this point of the initial Spanish conquest. How am I doing in time?
We're doing fine.
Okay.
If you want to go to the pictures, the most recent pictures.
Okay.
Is that something
sure. If you want,
Before you go to the pictures, in terms of the theme,
mm-hmm.
did you take a look or do any DNA? I mean, when we think of conquest, we also think of you're suppressed, and biologically.
Yeah.
Well, did you take a look at that at all?
I didn't, because I think more. My take is more is a historian, and what I was interested in is this idea of self-fashioning, self-identification. That it mattered less, really. To me, it seemed like in Mexico, if in the States, race and heritage is more biologically defined, or has been traditionally linked to this kind of quasi-scientific idea. In Mexico, it's much more about your customs, how do you dress, how do you live, what are your traditions, what are your stories. And what I found fascinating is that if the dominant discourse after the revolution is we're all mestizos, we're all the same, at an ideological level, but at a practical level, no, ni mucho menos, no. But what's interesting is that what it used to be with great pride, I'm mestizo, I'm part of the Mexican nation. It has become much more. I encountered, because this was over the span of 4 years I did the interviewing. Some of the people I interviewed the first year, by 4 years later, who self-identified as mestizo initially, and one even said, pero mestizo es como estar en la nada. Mm-hmm. It's this no man's land, She has just one grandparent who's indigenous, Zapotec, and she now self-identifies as indigenous. She's no, I'm not mestiza, I'm indigenous. I interviewed Gustavo Estava, who's an activist. He helped the Zapatistas, and he tells the story of how he was taught this, and he's probably in his 70s now. He was taught that our family comes from conquistadores from way back, or Spanish really. They had this big house in Mexico City, and his grandmother would come to visit. She was from Oaxaca, lived in a Zapotec village in Oaxaca. She had to go in the back door, and he started asking, well, why, if we are 100% Spanish background, do I have this Zapotec-speaking grandmother who has to go in the back door with indigenous servants? So he says what he had to do was this process of deprofessionalization to unlearn all these Western ways so that then he could get back to who he wants to be. And so he now lives in a Zapotec village. But he says, that doesn't mean I'm Zapotec. You know, you'll have to tell me who I am, but I'm deprofessionalized and I'm living in a Zapotec community, but I, you know. So I think that's what interested me more, is not so much biologically and through DNA what people were, but how people were claiming self-identification processes and how those were ongoing and transforming, and particularly in the wake of one of the things I look a lot at is the Zapatista uprising in '94 is kind of a parting of the waters. Mm-hmm.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry, but perhaps we should allow for Sheila Contreras to make her comments. She's our discussing, and then we open the floor for questions and answers, please. Is that good?
Sure. Or maybe since two people had their hands up, maybe just quickly take these two, and then we'll have Sheila come in and talk.
Yes, please.
Oh, yeah.
A quick question.
Real quick, in the U.S., the identification is often involved with the census question.
Yes.
Are we included in the census? Is it the same thing in Mexico? Do they have that self-identifying?
They do, and what's interesting is it's like in the U.S., more people are identifying in different ways, and yet all other outward indicators are that it hasn't changed. Things have not changed as radically as the census showed them changing, and some people are changing their self-categorization. Yeah.
My question is not short, so I'll wait till.
Okay.